So we finished, actually we ended last week on a bit of a cliffhanger. Where are we in Genesis? I already gave you a hint, in Genesis. Where are we? Where did we stop last week? Somebody bookmark the Bibles? Yep, yeah, absolutely, and that's chapter 44. Yes, chapter 44. And the response, what did Joseph do? How did he greet them, or what did he put them through? This time.
Send them back a goat or silver cup.
Yeah, what was the purpose of putting the cup in one of their bags?
To get Benjamin to say, right?
He put it in Benjamin's bag and then sent someone after him to go catch him. Why Benjamin's bag? And why do that in the first place? Why not just keep Benjamin there? Benjamin was his real brother, yep. But he could have just kept Benjamin and said, okay, the rest of you go back. Why the...
He's going to test him.
Yeah, how's he testing?
Their loyalty to their baby brother.
Right, because when did they last fail a loyalty test to their baby brother? When they sold the brother of Benjamin into slavery. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bit of a test going on. He's wanting to see how they treat the sons of Rachel, the favored wife, if there's still resentment and bitterness, and if they're still scheming and plotting to save their own lives, or if they do what they did in fact do, which is they all return. And why did they all return? Why not just send Benjamin back? I mean, the servant said, only the person whose sack the cup is found in is going to be my slave. Why did they all go back?
Why did they all back take care of him and not let him?
Why?
Couldn't go back to Jacob without
Yeah,
Jacob wasn't going to let him go to begin with. And
right.
was it Judah that guaranteed him what he was
Yep, Judah guaranteed his own life. Reuben did the first time, and Jacob wouldn't let him. And then Judah did after it got so bad that Jacob had to send him back. And so there's a sense that they can't return to their father, having lost both, well, not lost, having gotten rid of one favorite son, and then at this point having turned their back on the other. There would have been shame, there would have been heartbreak, they all would have been cursed in the eyes of their father, or in the eyes of God, or in their own eyes. You get the sense that they realized they can't return without Benjamin. And so Judah tells Joseph why, in a really moving speech that he gives. He recounts everything, and he says, he ends it with verse 34, how can I go back to my father if the boy's not with me? Do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father. And so we learn from this that the misery that Jacob experienced when Joseph was gone or was presumed dead. So he's not wanting to repeat that again. And at that point in the narrative, it's too much to bear for Joseph, because throughout this, he's wept twice. He's going to weep 3 times. And first time he kind of hid it at the table, or at the next table. The second time he wept when he saw him again, he went in the other room, and then when he composed himself, he came out. And now the third time that he weeps is going to be openly in front of them when he can't contain himself anymore. You get the feeling that Joseph hasn't enjoyed this ruse, that this has been a necessary testing and an exploration of their character. It hasn't been something that he did just for fun or just as a joke or just to get back at his brothers. So chapter 45, when Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants and cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they'd done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God has sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. You see some themes of Genesis in this. God preserving a remnant on earth, or that could also be translated a remnant in the land. God preserving, even when things seem lost, through famine, through flood, through rampant violence, through all the things that we've seen in Genesis, there's been God's plan to preserve this remnant, to preserve this seed, to preserve this promise, because this is still the book that started with the promise of God. Through the seed of Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Joseph is seeing that, and just as he was able to discern the dreams of Pharaoh, the dreams of a pagan king, about what's going to happen in the world, he's also able, we see, to discern the purposes of God in having him go to Egypt. He sees it all. He has the ability, he's a wise man, the text has already called him. And part of being wise is being able to discern what God's doing, or how things are being orchestrated. And so Joseph does this. He reveals this to his brothers, and he pleads with them, don't be mad at yourself. He gets the sense of it's okay. He's comforting his brothers because they are scared to death, and they should be. This is the brother that they sold as a slave. That's a capital offense, I believe, later in Torah, to sell a fellow Hebrew as a slave. It was an incredible shame, incredible family dishonor, all of it. And now they finally realize, 17 odd years later, 20 years later, something like that, or 13 years later, they realize our sin found us out. We didn't get away with it like we thought. And so they have every right to be terrified. And yet in this, Joseph gives mercy to them. He gives grace, because he can only give grace because he sees the bigger picture. When we see what God's doing in the world and look at things through the eyes of heaven, you get a new perspective, and you're able to give grace that's undeserved. If somebody's treating you horribly at work, and your natural inclination, or at your family, or in church, or somewhere, if somebody's nasty to you, your natural inclination is to get mad at them and judge them and be harsh back, or be defensive, or be self-righteous. But if you're given a glimpse into the fact that they just found out their mother has cancer, or they've just been through a horrible divorce, or whatever, if you're able to see outside of our own experience with that person or with those people, then that gives us an ability, it gives us a grace that we didn't have before. It gives us a grace to understand and to step into the other person's position. But only when we can see outside of ourselves. If we're just looking at our own situation, if Joseph had just looked at his own situation, his thoughts would have been, now's my chance to get even. Now they're going to have justice. They deserve justice. They deserve a judgment. And yet, through the eyes of grace, he's able to wipe all that away. Not because it didn't matter, not because it wasn't evil. It was evil and it did matter. But because he realizes that it's more important what God's doing, and for them to see, and for everyone to see what the bigger picture is in this.
He was quite harsh on it for a while.
When he was still disguised, he treated him very much as a noble from an Egyptian noble would have treated him. Yeah, absolutely. So, verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, and that's a title. Father to Pharaoh is the title for the advisor, or the vizier, the person who advises Pharaoh. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it really is I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. After them, his brothers talked with him. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. So there's a family reconciliation, and then what's Joseph's orders? What's his first priority?
Bob?
Yeah, his dad. He's the favored son, and his dad's been heartbroken for all these years. So tell him, first and foremost, tell him what's happened. Tell him that I'm not dead. His son wasn't killed. His son's alive. And tell him everything that's happened. And then do what with it?
Bring him back.
Bring him back quickly. That's what he says. He emphasizes it. Bring him back quickly. Why quickly? He's old. Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of time left. And it's not a day's journey. You know, it's a couple of weeks worth of trekking through the desert. There's no highways at this point. There's no rest stops. You know, there's no state patrol or any. I mean, it's a dangerous journey to go from there all the way to Egypt. So he's wanting, bring it. I want to be reunited as soon as possible, and come, and you guys are going to live in Goshen. Goshen is, so if a map of Egypt right here and the Nile flows up and then it fans out into the Nile Delta, if you look at it on Google Maps, it's just green. And it's green, and then it narrows down into a green strip that runs and zigzags all the way down into Africa, into Ethiopia. And that little strip is green, and everything else is barren and dry and almost worthless in terms of agriculture. But that green strip fans out, and the Goshen region would be, if you're facing me, it would be this part, the part closest to Canaan. So up the Mediterranean Sea, and Israel would be over here. And so he said they're going to live in Goshen, in the best part of Egypt, agriculturally speaking, which is perfect for them because they are pastoral shepherds. They raise flocks and herds. They grow some crops, but they're mostly animals. And that's something that the Egyptians weren't big on. They weren't, I mean, they utilized it, and they had agriculture, and they had animals, but they were more of the crops and the harvest and the grain type people. And so there was plenty of room for Israelites to come down and graze their flocks and to raise their cattle and to prosper. He's telling them, you're going to live in the best part of the land. Verse 16. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all of his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the best of the land. Or if you have an NIV, it says the fat of the land. The fat was the good part. To talk about the good portion of something, you'd say the fat of something. This is not in our culture and our weight loss minds focused. Fat is bad. Biblical days, fat is good. So the fat of the land is the good part of the land. And Pharaoh is giving them this pagan king. This is Joseph's family, the man who saved Egypt through his foresight and who has allowed Egypt to remain prosperous and be able to feed the world. His whole family is being welcomed. Like, bring them all. And Pharaoh said, verse 19, you're directed to tell them, do this, take carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. In other words, don't worry about what you've got. Whatever you've got back home, we've got a lot more and a lot better here. And it's yours. I have a friend who do martial arts. The martial arts instructor who teaches my instructor is world famous, and one of his students and close friends is the Sheikh in Abu Dhabi. And he didn't know that until many years later, but found out he was royalty, this young Arab guy that had been training with him. And so the Sheikh will fly him over to train for a couple of weeks at a time, or fly him over to come, and it's always like, just sends a text or calls and said, hey, come stay with me for a few weeks. Come on up. You don't have to pack it. He's like, he's telling us, like, I don't have to pack anything. I just get on the plane, I get there, private limo takes me to the royal residence, there's all the clothes I need, I don't have to take anything. I'm set because I'm a member, I'm a visitor, I'm a guest, I'm a friend of the royal family. And that's what's being extended here in this section. It's like, hey, come on, just move, we'll take care of you. And that's only possible because Joseph had already been there and been elevated to that position after he was sold as a slave, but through the actions of God in his, the worst of the worst, while he's in the dungeon of the slave, or of the prison. So through all that, now we see, looking back, Joseph's able to see, and the readers are able to see how God's plan providentially worked out, even through the actions of people who had no clue at the time or no intention of following God's plan. His brothers freely chose to sell him into slavery. No one twisted their arm and made them act in a way that they didn't want to act, and they did it. But we see that even in that, God's sovereignty is bigger than that. And it didn't override their choice. It worked through their choice to accomplish God's greater good in spite of that. And that gives us examples of how we deal with everything in Scripture when we see God accomplishing something, but it involves human evil and human decisions and human free will. How do those two things work together? You have whole denominations that will split over that issue. But Scripture just lays it out here, and it says, God did such and such, and then at the same time, you sold me into slavery. Both are true. How are both true? Through the sovereignty of God, not negating the free decisions of people that really are bad, but using that, almost co-opting it or planning ahead, taking it into account, so to speak. And however it works out in your theology and everything else is up to you, but the Genesis text just kind of presents both of those. I'm your brother who you sold into slavery, but God sent me down here. Both are true.
That's really good news for us, you know?
I think so.
I mean, no matter what happens in life, or what you make decisions, and if they're wrong, God still can work.
God can work through even the worst circumstances and the worst decisions. Yeah, Genesis over and over, that's the theme, that's been the theme this year. We've been in Genesis for a year, and the theme of Genesis has been God's plan will come about despite all of the dumb and bad and evil and stupid and wicked stuff that people do along the way, whether it's God's people or other people doing it to them. So there's a comfort in that. Now that doesn't get them off the hook. That didn't make Joseph stay in prison any more comfortable.
Yeah.
At the time, that didn't make the temptations from Potiphar's wife any less powerful. It didn't make his brother's actions any less wrong. None of the temporal consequences are negated through that. But there's the bigger promise that despite all of that, God's plan is going to come to fruition, even if we have to endure a lot of evil along the way. And we don't have the vision, we don't have the ability to see it in that moment. The New Testament example of all examples is obviously the cross. None of Jesus' disciples, well, they had all fled. The one standing there, the disciple whom he loved, and Mary and the other Mary and a few of the women standing at the foot of the cross, none of them would have looked at what was going on and thought, let's call this Good Friday.
Yeah.
Right? None of them would have ever come to that conclusion. Nobody looking at the cross as it was happening would have ever thought this will be the turning point in human history and will be the most celebrated symbol in the entire world. Right? But we, looking back, have that perspective and we can see that. And so we get a sense of how that works, and it's even here in Genesis. Joseph's example is a great parallel. But yes, the Genesis account gives us that. It front loads the biblical story with it grounds the story of Israel in the sovereign promises of God and the security that they can take hold of because of that, as a people, as a group, as the elect. That's what Israel was in the Old Testament. They were the elect of God. So they can put their hope in this God, even when the day-to-day things look like they're just going all to pieces. And they can do that because they see God doing this over and over and over. And Joseph's a great example. So finishing out this section, verse 21. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, and this is where your translation will differ, or may differ. He said to them, either don't quarrel along the way, or don't fear along the way. Either of those could, the verb means to stir up, and it could be translated as don't fear, like don't be afraid. Either don't be afraid that this is all a big plot and I'm really going to get vengeance on you once I have Dad back here, then you're done. Because they still think that, and they will think that for the rest of Jacob's life. The brothers will think that on into Genesis 50, the last chapter. You'll still see them wrestling with, okay, when's he going to drop the hammer? When are we going to get what's due to us? They still can't understand that concept. So either he's telling them, don't worry about that. Don't be afraid along the way. Don't fear. Just go. I'm going to protect you and keep you safe and bring you back, all that. Or if it means don't quarrel along the way, then what he's telling him is, okay, one, I know your nature. You guys are prone to disputes, to say the least. But also, when they go back and tell Jacob, hey, Joseph's alive, what else do they have to tell him?
What they did.
Yes. Why then did we bring you back his clothing and say he was killed by a wild animal? Why? They have to explain. And that may be the grounds for a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame, because both Reuben and Judah both tried to not get them to do what they were going to do. You know, one, they wanted to kill him, and then one said, no, Reuben said, don't kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. So there could be some finger pointing by Reuben saying, hey, I'm the reason that all this happened. Me, the firstborn. I'm the reason that the world is saved because I was the one who said, sell him into slavery, don't kill him. And at the same time, Judah was hatching a plan all along to go and rescue Joseph and bring him back to Dad to get in his good graces. Or that might be vice versa. I might have confused Reuben and Judah. Regardless, the two of those. So there may be some finger pointing on his and saying, hey, I tried to rescue him, but they had already sold him into slavery when I wasn't even there. So there could be some of that. There could be this jostling for power, this petty, getting back in God's good graces. And what Joseph's saying is the rewards or the blessing that awaits is so great that it makes all of those things pale in comparison. Any ideas of who's right and who's wrong and squabbling and who's going to be next in the pecking order and all of that stuff, it just does not matter in proportion to getting back here to Egypt and letting the family be reunited and enjoying the fat of the land and becoming a people numerous like the stars in the sky. And this is all part of what's been going on through Genesis, all the way back to Genesis 15. God made the covenant, and what did he say to Abraham? Know this for certain. Your descendants will be in a foreign land for 400 years. This is the beginning of that. That Israel was going to have to spend time in Egypt, 4 generations or 400 years, before they then go back into Canaan. So all of this is, we're seeing how the big picture plan is working itself out on the micro level, or on the level of the details. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he's ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. That literally says Jacob's heart grew numb, or his heart became numb, because he did not believe them. There was this sense of his unbelief is portrayed as a numbness of heart, or just a deadness, or stunned is, it's technically right, but it doesn't quite capture what's going on there. The next verse, though, but when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So when he's told, yeah, the greatest thing you can imagine has happened, and he just can't process it. He's in unbelief. But then when he sees for himself the proof of it, the tangible, then he's overwhelmed. His spirit is revived, it says. And we get a hint of that in the New Testament, what happens. You know, when Thomas is told, hey, Jesus appeared to us.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, whatever. And then when he sees it, that's when he falls at his feet and gives the confession, my Lord and my God, which is the culmination of John's entire gospel. So it's like that here. There's this, he's not going to believe just on hearsay. He's not going to believe based on what they say. He's got to see it for himself. And there's nothing wrong with that. When he does, though, his spirits revive. And Israel said, I am convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So, family is going to be reunited. There's just a journey between Canaan and Egypt that they have to make it through. At this point, we're going to see next chapter next week who goes down to Egypt and how they get there, and then what happens once they're there. And all of this is setting the stage for Exodus. All of this is laying the groundwork. Genesis is the prelude, the backstory to Exodus, if you will, because Exodus is where it all begins as a nation, as the people of Israel. So that is it. We're out of time. There's plenty of food. So if you want seconds, come get it, and we'll see you next week.